Okay, thanks very much for the invitation today. And I think this is a really important topic, and it's a really good time to discuss it. The research that I'm going to be talking about today is research that I've done as an academic. I'm working on it with other people as a report, but I wanted in this capacity to be talking about my own part of it, my own research on it. And I can, at the end, if there's interest, I could talk a little bit about the global context, but I'm going to really focus on the United States. So the topic focus is on protests and whether or not freedom of expression is under threat and freedom of association. So here is a recent image of Portland, Oregon, and federal officers advancing on Black Lives Matter protesters and a protest. I'll talk a bit about the federal aspect, but that is something that kind of reaches another level. And so it's somewhat of an added conversation to have. But the question about whether or not civic engagement is under threat is something that we've been looking at and I've been looking at for the last couple of years. So before, predating most recent events. And I'm going to divide the talk into talking about laws and state legislation first, and then move into the tactics, and that kind of draws more on like discriminatory aspects of the approach to protests. I should also say that what we're looking at here and what I'm looking at is very recent. And so there's historic points that are very important to kind of understand what's happening now. And we can make comparisons with the past. I'm not necessarily saying what's better, what's worse. I am just really wanting to talk about this moment, how we got here, where we are, what has happened. And certainly in recent years, there have been new developments. So the first of the new developments that you can see kind of the summary there is that in the last 4 years, there have been proposals in almost every state of the United States, maybe not every, 40, that have been introduced to restrict the right of protest. And I'll talk about the ways that they most commonly do that in a few minutes. 24 of those laws have been enacted, so it's not that 40 states have these laws now. But the point is that even the kind of approach and the addition of criminalization, the addition of new penalties is something that's significant, and it's certainly front and center in our politics today. So the legislation is one part, and then the tactics are another. So some of the images that we see recently are of a very combative law enforcement approach to freedom of expression, a militarized approach, heavy-handedness, which is not, it's police forces and law enforcement is not a monolith. It's not every city, it's not every town, but it's somewhat common, especially in big cities. Criminalization of protesters, surveillance, and I'll talk a little bit more kind of later in the talk about those issues. And then certainly use of federal forces. So if we look a little closer at the legislation, so there have been, as I mentioned, 24 laws that were enacted. I'm just giving you some of the, these are all just like samples. I'm just giving you ideas of the types of laws so that you get a sense of what we're referring to here. So one big thread is laws that are called critical infrastructure laws. So they penalize and criminalize trespass or damage on critical infrastructure. And a lot of those are defined very broadly. So they could include pipelines and power plants all the way to telephone poles. So the idea that trespassing on or damaging those critical infrastructure points is going to be a new criminal, or result in a new criminal penalty. There is also in some of the states what they call liability for conspirator organizations. So if an organization, arguably if an organization has organized, called for a protest on a certain issue, their individual members may not have been the ones that have trespassed, but some of these laws allow for up to $1 million in fines for having kind of orchestrated a protest that leads to that trespass or damage. So that's one area that you see, and you can see the number of states that these laws have been enacted. Increased penalties or added criminalization for engaging in riot. A lot of states have rather broad riot definitions. I'll show you New Jersey's in a second. But what we see is that there have been increased penalties. And so that might mean that, what used to be a misdemeanor offense is going to become a felony. Or that there are newer circumstances or a broader definition added. There's a variety of different ways that rioting has been changed. Anti-face covering laws were enacted in 17 states, and that is that's significant. It was predating COVID, so it was the idea that if you're protesting, you should be visual. It links in with the surveillance component. Limitations on campus protests. Only one of these laws was enacted, but I think, again, you get the kind of chilling effect of proposing laws. Some of the laws are about limiting space on campuses where people can protest. Others would require universities to have certain specific sanctions against students. So some of the laws are saying if a student protests on campus property, they should automatically be suspended if they are in violation, if they don't have the right permit or they're not in the right place to protest. There's a huge question of whether or not that could pass constitutional scrutiny, but nonetheless, there have been these efforts and proposals in legislatures. So I'll give you South Dakota as a more specific example. They have added 4 different provisions. One would add to interference with traffic. So there's new areas that would be considered, blocking traffic, added penalties for that, and identification of what is trespassing. Trespassing can include anything that is not allowed for in the protest permit. There's a new felony crime of incitement to riot that just was signed by the governor in the last few months. And there is civil liability for what they call riot boosting. So that could include a person or an organization that is not directly involved in a protest, but who encourages or solicits others to a protest, and as long as it involves acts of force or violence. So the question there is whether or not, how exactly will that be interpreted? Would it be interpreted, an act of force if somebody, is it the way that they explain what the protest is going to be? Is it the way that they talk about it? What exactly is the evidence that's going to support that? The riot boosting law was challenged by the ACLU because previously it was defined more broadly than what I have here. And so a federal judge said it would violate the First Amendment. And so South Dakota went back and revised it to what you see here. They also dropped what was a crime that would have been riot boosting as well. And they changed it to this crime that you see as incitement to riot. So there is back and forth and challenges on a lot of these laws. So New Jersey would be an unlikely candidate for added laws in this regard, but we're not immune to the proposals. And so what you see here is our current definition of rioting, which is a person is guilty of riot if he participates with 4 or more people in a course of disorderly conduct with the purpose to commit or facilitate the commission of a crime. So it has to be with that aim, with that intention. You'll see the definition of disorderly conduct there is rather broad. Any tumult, it's a broader definition than what I have here, or I mean, it's a wider, there's more precise parts of it, but I'm highlighting the most kind of ambiguous, which it can include any tumultuous behavior that causes public annoyance. So, you know, the question being, what if somebody was swearing and yelling? Is that tumultuous behavior? It can be recklessly done. It doesn't always have to be intentional, whereas rioting is intentional. There is a proposal in the Assembly right now to expand the definition of rioting to include disorderly conduct conducted with 4 or more, resulting in property damage. You'll see that essentially what it means is it doesn't matter if there was that intention to commit or facilitate a crime. Instead, if it does, even if it's accidental, if it does result in property damage, then under this proposal, you know, there would be rioting. And so it's, you know, as I said, I think it's unlikely that that will be passed, but that same type of a provision has been proposed in 2017 in New Jersey, 2018, and now in March of this year. Another proposal in New Jersey would be for mandatory penalties for campus protesters. And that was an August 2019 proposal that hasn't seemed to go anywhere. So I think maybe if we kind of then like step back a second, with you now having a bit of familiarity about the types of laws that have been introduced, I think one of the central themes that I have found is this identification of demonstrators as harmful and as doing harm. So that maybe historically that was the case as well. But now we have this compulsion for added penalties, new penalties. So arguably what we already have in terms of definitions of protest, definitions of rioting, definitions of disorderly conduct, definitions of trespass, definitions of obstructing traffic, throughout the United States, we have all those kind of laws. But suddenly in the last 3 or 4 years, there has been an urge to look at the state level at whether or not there should be added provisions or new penalties or turning misdemeanors into felonies. And those obviously have a big consequence for individual lives. Anyone who has been arrested for being involved in a protest knows that. And so, we want to. I just want to sort of make that that point that's where it's moving away from a right to association. Let's allow people to go out and have their say and participate in the democratic process. And instead, it's sort of from the outset looking at it as potentially a crime. And again, that is not something new, but there are new provisions here that seem to be the case. So why 2016? Some of the law, or a lot of the laws that I mentioned on the previous slide are being put together by, there's an organization called the International Center for Nonprofit Law, and they have a U.S. protest law tracker, which I can send links to if anyone's interested in looking at it. And So the law protest tracker essentially is pulling these together, and they started tracking it in 2016 after a notable increase. So the question becomes, why 2016? Why 2017? I think that Standing Rock is one of the, it's not the only reason, it's one of the big reasons. And so you see here images of the militarized presence at the protests surrounding the Dakota Access Pipeline near the Standing Rock Reservation. So these images and the kind of height of that was in 2016. At the bottom there, you see the types of cages that protesters allege that they were put into when they were held and arrested. So during that period of time, the fall of 2016, there were hundreds arrested. There were use of dogs. There were a lot of people who were treated for hypothermia because they were sprayed with water cannons and it was freezing. And I'm sure you all are familiar with those images. It wasn't that long ago. So this kind of like heavy-handed response, and there was at the state level arguments about the need to then develop the critical infrastructure laws and that sort of thing. You also kind of have to put in the frame of the 2016-2017 period of time is the Black Lives Matter movement. So sort of took off after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin. The acquittal was in 2013, and the kind of development and expansion of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then in 2014, in August, was the killing of Michael Brown and the Ferguson protests that kicked off then, which I'll talk again in a few minutes about that. So again, these aren't the only factors, and I'm somewhat avoiding talking purely on politics because I really just want to kind of focus on what is happening at the legal level, so the law and the practice. But obviously there's the political context too. Most of the proposals are put forward by conservative members at the state level. There is also, I can note, there's an organization, a think tank called the American Legislative Exchange Council, you may be familiar with, and they have drafted a number of the laws that then have been taken up by state legislators. So a lot of these laws have literally identical phrasing or identical provisions. Some modifications happen, obviously, but there are model laws that are put forward by the ALEC. The acronym is ALEC, the ALEC think tank. So if we move into the part of the talk that talks more about the tactics, then we can kind of frame and look at this question of how free and equal protests are in the United States. So one of the things that I think that I see is a convergence of law and order criminal justice that has led to racial profiling, and I'm identifying what happens commonly as racial profiling. There have been court cases that have found whole police departments in violation of constitutional rights. So Newark Police Department, New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, there have been agreements with them, and under the Obama administration, the Justice Department Civil Rights Division over how they're policing and the kind of racial profiling and the stop and searches and that sort of thing. So that is part of the story. And there's a good book if you haven't seen it. It was written in 2010, and there's a updated version in the last couple of years by Michelle Alexander about mass incarceration. and institutional racism in the criminal justice system. And she kind of goes through bias that takes place in stop and search, in arrests, in who's prosecuted, in bail decisions, the conduct of trials, the sentencing, all leading to the bigger situation of mass incarceration in the US. The book is called The New Jim Crow. I think that is part of the story. A part of the story is militarized law enforcement. There's also this global trend towards shrinking space for civil dissent. So in other countries, it may look different. It may be more about regulating nonprofit organizations and restrictions on organizations that help migrants. But you also see heavy-handed attacks on just straight up protests. Increased opportunity and means of surveillance. So surveillance is nothing new of people who are part of social movements. But right now we have the social media and new technology, face recognition technology. You have evidence of and information in court cases about police and the FBI tracking people through their Facebook posts and that kind of thing. So that is part of it too. Let's look a little bit. We'll look at a few of these different areas, and again, I'm talking in a general sense. I'm talking. I'm not saying every police department acts in the same way, but this is where we are with a lot of the approach to protests. One last point on the surveillance. So again, through court cases, there have been information that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have labeled certain Black Lives Matter members as Black identity extremists. And the information that they have that we have through court cases about the FBI's identification of that label sort of harks back to 40 years ago and Black activists, and so there has been this assumption that or presumption of violence without the current evidence to support that. FBI conducted knock and talks with Standing Rock activists in 2017, so there has been evidence there of surveillance of these groups that I've talked about. So I guess to move into it, I think that the argument that I'm making is that there is a distinction that is made between different types of protests. So it's not that it's not a clear continuum, but that you can see differences. Something that has been noted pretty starkly lately is the comparison of the approach to Black Lives Matter protests after the death of George Floyd with the anti-lockdown protesters that had taken place just about a month earlier. So the two photos you have on the right are of protesters in Michigan protesting the lockdown measures and provisions. And on the left, you have the Minnesota police in May, kind of approaching near their precinct. So the idea that in a lot of the lockdown protests, anti-lockdown protests, people were armed, and the thought of what would happen if Black Lives Matters protesters came out armed. So there seems to be more of an accommodation that is not accommodation for a lot of protesters that is not granted to Black Lives Matters protesters, and that there's a perception of violence, which is not to say there wasn't property damage, but they're, you know, but they were also assumed to be violent from the outset. We also need to distinguish between the heavy militarized presence and its usefulness in different contexts. So, for example, if there is mass looting in Los Angeles, it's appropriate for there to be a much heavier response and people, police departments being able to protect themselves, being able to have the appropriate equipment with them, as opposed to coming out with that equipment when there are protesters that are peaceful in other cities. So, you know, there is that. To kind of, you know, make the point that this is not, the law enforcement is not a monolith. There were nearby examples of police departments who took a very different approach to the Black Lives Matter protests in recent weeks, in the last couple months. But we have a lot of major cities in the United States where the, you know, perhaps not every day of the protests were as you know, harsh and that, but there was a common thread that you see. So number one is the militarized police presence. So use of tanks, armored police vehicles, flying helicopters at low altitude to disperse people. Is a tactic that's used in some cities. Really extensive use of rubber bullets and non-lethal projectiles. Tear gas. So as one example, in Portland, there was use of tear gas by the Portland Police Department. And the organizations there took the police department to court, so federal court, to stop it. As a result, a federal judge prohibited the use of tear gas except in exceptional circumstances. And then we see federal troops coming into Portland using tear gas. So, you know, new court cases have to come to stop their practice. And in the meantime, there were other, you know, developments that took place. So the use of tear gas really prevalent. Carrying assault weapons, flashbang grenades, and, you know, other means of threatening the crowds. Okay, so let me just make sure I'm kind of, so, and you also see in these circumstances, when I had mentioned the profiling point, that there seems to be the arrests of legal observers and journalists who are people of color seems to be a common thread. So I think that we need to wait and get the numbers on that, but it's just a point to be made that certainly there seems to be anecdotally a lot of legal observers. People are considered more of a potential threat if they're people of color. The Washington Post has reported that there's 14,000 arrests through June or June 22nd of this year. Most of the arrests are violating curfew or failure to disperse. Then there's unlawful assembly, trespassing, vandalism, property destruction, and theft. The violating curfew, I have that highlighted because a number of people were arrested for that. And then when those curfew laws were challenged, a number of cities like Los Angeles and New York revoked the curfew. And so it became a moot issue, but at that point, it arguably had already made an impact in people's ability to you know, associate and free expression. There was an argument in a opinion piece that looked at militarization, which we'll get to in a minute. And it was by somebody who has studied the transfer of military techniques to local law enforcement. And he talks about the commonality between the circumstances in Iraq, where regular people became irate when they were treated cruelly and with deep suspicion, and how you can see that happen in the United States as well. Another, the property damage point, I think that we have to look at the level of it. You know, is it spray paint, or is it damaging businesses? There's, you know, there are clear levels there. And so we would need to kind of parse that out a little bit more in detail once we have more data from this period of time. Just to give a bit of background on militarization, again, it might be a topic that you're familiar with and might not be. The origins are from the 1960s and 1970s, but the transfer of equipment that was military grade equipment and actually used, a lot of it was used in the Gulf War, really took off in the 1990s after the Gulf War. So there was a transfer to local police. There's reports that by 2014, more than $5 billion of surplus equipment had been moved from the Department of Defense and the Pentagon to local law enforcement. There was not, along with that, a specific training program, which is not to say that there was no training at all, but there was not a specific kind of centralized training program for it. Initially, it could only be used for the war on drugs, and then that kind of like caveat exception provision was removed. So there was really very little limits, or is very little limits on the use of it. There was a requirement to use it or lose it. So there was an incentive, and there was a development of SWAT teams, or embellishment of SWAT teams, and a new role for SWAT teams within police departments. After Ferguson, in 2014, there was a review by the Obama administration of the use of this equipment and the militarization of the police. And so in 2015, after a report was issued, there was a revocation of some of the equipment. There was limitation on how it could be used, and mandating of certain training. So arguably, under the Obama administration, if that had been able to continue, it wouldn't have eliminated the militarization, but it would have limited it. In 2017, the Trump administration reversed that order, and so again took away those limitations that had been placed on it. I think that one of the first times it really came together for a lot of people that the law enforcement was so militarized was watching the images of the Ferguson protests in 2014. I think that these photos speak to 2 points. One would be the militarization generally, and what has been argued as sort of an urban warfare approach to demonstrators. Again, not everywhere, but we see it in a lot of places. But they're also good photos, I think, for focusing on the kind of cycle that you see, of, you know, people are protesting police brutality, and then they're tear gassed, and there is rage from that, and it can lead to cycles. And so we have from, you know, really from the 1960s, there's a legacy here we can see, and there is a need to address so many structural issues that lead to the situation that we have, and so that has to be kind of considered in the mix. One of the things that happened at Ferguson was that the police used what they called a keep moving order. So in places where there were protests, they mandated that the protesters keep moving. And there were threats of arrest or actual arrest if people didn't keep moving. And I think that the point there is, again, a chilling effect. So you may not have that many people who were convicted of failing to move. But in the moment, you are keeping people, keeping people going, keeping people not stopping, keeping people, limiting their expression and their ability to, to associate in the way that they want to. So that is something that is one of the tactics used. Okay, so let's turn. I'm going to try to sort of wrap up in the next 10 minutes, but I wanted to make just a few points about the constitutional provisions. I'm not going to go into great detail. I think people are so familiar with the First Amendment. The First Amendment is looked at as one of the kind of quintessential constitutional rights we have. And so I'm just wanted to give a bit of what I see as a context for the decision making in this area. So you see here a visual from South Carolina in 1961, and it was marches on the State House in South Carolina by high school students and college students. It led to almost 200 arrests, and there's a court case that we still teach in constitutional law, which is the Edwards versus South Carolina case. And it was found that it was within the protesters' constitutional rights to be in that protest, and that their arrest was, against the First Amendment. So a lot of the cases in the late 1950s, early 1960s were of this ilk, that favored protesters, that allowed there to be or overturn convictions, certainly for things like sit-ins. So what you would call minor violations of the law when it was looked at as the law as illegitimate. So Supreme Court decision making, this is not at all exhaustive, but I just want to make a few kind of common threads, common points. You've got positive outcomes for anti-racist activists, including overturning of trespassing convictions. And a lot of that was not on the grounds of freedom of association or freedom of expression. It was more on the grounds of finding that the laws that they were trespassing were illegitimate laws, so segregation laws. In 1966, there was a case, Adderley versus Florida. In that case, there were university students who protested racial segregation in jails. So they were protesting because some of their fellow students had been jailed the day before and were in segregated jails. So they were protesting, again, these segregation policies, if not laws. And their convictions for trespassing were upheld. And a lot of people look at this as kind of a turning point. And one observer has made the point that these students had raised fists as opposed to the students in the early 1960s who were linking arms, holding hands, or making very clear points that they were spread out and that they were not quote unquote angry. Subsequently, in general, the Supreme Court finds that civil disobedience is not justified. So if there is a violation of misdemeanor laws or any other laws, there isn't a finding that, oh, okay, they had a freedom of association or freedom of expression right, and so they shouldn't be convicted of this. It means that a lot of people who are arrested are put in quite difficult positions, even if the laws or the points that they are making, they believe are against illegitimate or unconstitutional actions. And so you have people, for example, somebody who's a legal observer who's arrested, who has to choose between, settling the case, or pleading the case for a misdemeanor, versus being taken to court and potentially having a felony charge against them. There is one legal academic, Justin Hansford, who argues that the influence of the Black activists in the late 1960s, challenging structural problems like police brutality went to a different level as far as threatening the overall system. So his argument is that that's why you see the Supreme Court shifting here. And that it was, a lot of the cases were not about freedom of expression, but more about the clear segregation laws and policies being problematic. So the question then remains, what about, protesting what's looked at as illegitimate laws, or what about minor violations of laws to make a point, or situations where it's argued that the police have failed to protect protesters from others, from counter-protesters. In terms of, I just have some quotes here. Again, I'm almost finished, and we can have some conversation about some of these points. But I also wanted to just point out that the United States has been, on all issues, any human rights provision that we sign up to, we are under scrutiny by the United Nations committees on our adherence to the standards that are in those provisions. And so routinely, as with every country. So a few points that have been made in the last couple of years by UN officials. The first quote is by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Peaceful Assembly and Association. And that is making a point that the context of racism then affects the exercise of association and assembly rights. So that in effect is some of what I've been talking about in the second part of this talk, is that it seems, it seems from the heavy-handed presence that there is a different perspective and approach to demonstrations when it is anti-racist protests. And that is something that has been pointed out by the UN Special Rapporteur. Another UN Special Rapporteur on human rights defenders argued about the prosecution of peaceful activists as having a chilling effect. So that was in response actually to something that happened earlier in 2014, which was in Michigan, water protesters. So protesters on the right to water. There were a number of them that were arrested for trespass. And so, arguments there about how we treat and how we handle those kind of cases, it really has an effect on who then goes out the next time to make a statement. Then the final quote is from the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And that was after the Unite the Right protest and counter-protest in 2017. It's a somewhat of a separate point that I'm making, but I thought it's useful to include it, that the freedoms that we have, they argue should not be used to promote racist hate speech and racist crimes. So our approach to the First Amendment is quite unique, and the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination would allow for hate speech to be criminalized, not only when it leads to violence or is likely to lead to violence, but hate speech just generally. And a lot of other countries would take that approach. So we have a different calculation and history in relation to that, but there have been plenty of people who have argued that just as there are limitations on the First Amendment for defamation and for incitement to violence, that there is scope. We have, it's within our means to also limit hate speech if we desire to. Okay, so the final slide. How can we resume our place as a global leader on human rights? I'm more than happy to hear your views on that. There's a lot of possible areas that we can look at in that regard. A few arguments or a few kind of points that brings up to me is this question that was raised again by that academic that I had mentioned, Justin Hansford. He's arguing in the last month that the protesters who have been arrested in the last few months should get amnesty. And he really looks at it as a balance between that we are focusing more on property violations than, so the focus on the property violations has allowed for people to get tear gas, people to be injured. There's one person was injured and needed surgery in her face for a non-lethal projectile right outside the federal courthouse in Portland. So that would be one of those examples. And then a question that we can raise that was in the opinion piece by John Lewis just recently, published right after he had passed away, about, what should we consider good trouble? What are, what do we want as a society? Do we want to discourage any activism, any demonstrations, and where are the boundaries of that? And certainly the United States, I would argue, continues to look at us, individuals in the United States continue to look at ourselves as having a constitution that can weather these issues. And so where is it that we can shift? And how can we dislodge what I would argue is this disproportionate impact on activists who are fighting against racism? And I guess I will leave it there. So I think what I'm going to do, just so that is probably stop the screen share. If I can figure out how to do it. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so I've removed the mute from my side, so people can now unmute themselves. We'll see how that works. Worked well in the recent past, so I think we'll operate that way. So first, I want to thank our speaker, Marny. That was great. Thanks for giving us that perspective. I certainly learned quite a bit from the talk. I mean, I've been familiar with many of these issues. I've participated in protests, watched them on the news and such, and seen a very different experience from the suburbs where I've participated and the cities where all the media attention has been. So be interesting actually to have you talk a little bit about that question, because I've been to half a dozen events in central New Jersey, and they've all gone off very peacefully, and in most cases the police are either very neutral or demonstrably supportive of the protesters' aims. Be interested to get your take on that. But I guess you can address that, and then I'll let people unmute themselves and ask questions. If we have a collision, we'll just try and be polite about it, and I'll try and do a little bit of traffic cop with the with questions. So so I guess you can react to that, and then I'll get other questions lined up. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think one of the points there is the more local you get, the more you have community relations with the police. You know, I think that there's the bigger the setting, the more potential you have for there to need to be or perception of the need to be a certain response. And but there are so many areas in the country where there maintains this sort of us them attitude about not maybe protest, but also community by community. And so if you have a police force that's predominantly white and you have a community of protesters and they're predominantly African-American or other people of color, there is this us them perception. And I think that it's not, it's all about individual communities. And what I'm looking at is these bigger trends. And so you certainly have, in some areas, community policing has really been embedded. And there has been a lot of efforts by police departments to make it so that even if they say Camden, even if it's a big place, that there are common threads, there's community meetings, there are, a person may not know a certain person's face, but they have groups in common and they put in effort. And some of that is from, I had kind of briefly mentioned the consent, I'm not sure I did, but the consent decrees. So some police departments who were accused or found to have violated constitutional rights through stop and search have gone through processes to address that. And they either came up with a consent decree as part of a settlement of a case, or voluntarily came up with this is how we are planning to reform our practices. And a lot of those in places were effective. Some of them are still work in progress. The Civil Rights Division has stopped a lot of those the Justice Department have stopped a lot of those investigations now. So there hasn't been a lot of activity or demand from the federal government on the local police departments. And yet local police in a lot of areas have understood that community relations are so key. You have you have more good leadership, I think, in certain areas.
Okay, Lois, I see your hand up. Why don't you go?
I came a little late to the meeting, so I don't know if an announcement was made about a peaceful march that's going to be at 2 o'clock today at the Elberon train station. President Trump is attending a very high stakes fundraiser in Elberon, which is a part of Long Branch. So now, Marny, all of the things that you said really resonated with me. It was an excellent presentation. What do we have to know about carrying signs, or is there anything that we should avoid if we're going to a protest to make sure that we are operating within the law?
I think, to be honest, I think no. I mean, I think that the breaking of the law is the property damage stuff. It's not, if people are in a place and it's where the protest is, it's too much to expect every person to show up to know the permit. That is really the job of law enforcement, to say, oh, sorry, that street is not part of it, or to have blocked off that street. The onus is not on the individuals who show up to, as long as they're going where the talks are being held or the other protesters are. It can't be something that is an expectation. So there, and again, like holding signs, there is a different, even offensive signs, there's a level of understanding, a person may not want to hold an offensive sign, but if a person chooses to make a point, as long as it's not inciting someone else to violence or to, you know, in this day and age, inciting them to break any other laws, then it's fair game, really. Does that answer the question? I mean, yeah.
It does. And once again, 2 o'clock at the Elberon train station, and then the group will march to the ocean where the event is being held at one of the large mansions.
Lee?
Yes. Thanks for a helpful and useful talk. I am a member of ACLU. What other organizations might be effective in pushing against this trend?
Okay, so the NAACP is still one, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, is an organization. I had mentioned the IPNL.
What was
That's
that again?
the International Center for Nonprofit Law. And they have they have really good resources. They also have resources on the COVID-19 provisions. And so I think those are some of the organizations, but Black Lives Matter, the local organizations that you might know of that are New Jersey specific. I think that one point I should make is that after these protests in the last month and a half or 2 months, a number at the city level, there have been some changes that have been made and laws that have been passed to protect protesters. So for example, while militarization hasn't been revoked by, or, you know, there hasn't been a revocation or taking back of this equipment by the federal government, some cities are deciding that they don't, that they need to put their own limitations on the use of this equipment. So that's happening. There has been revocations of a couple of the anti-face covering laws. And we may see some other shifts in that regard. I forgot to mention that point.
Okay. Laura, you want to go? Go ahead. Laura, can you hear us?
Okay, yeah, sure. So, you know, I am a retired cop, and we did have a number of venues where protests happened frequently. And our staff there, of course, teaching constitutional law in police academy, at least when I went, was pretty much very brief. And although everybody swears to uphold the Constitution when they're sworn in, they just take their cues from leadership. I don't know if any of them ever read it. My aunt, who's a frequent protester, whenever they ask her if she has a permit, she just waves the Constitution and says, "This is my permit to be here." But it's one of the weird things about some of the protests going on now are these sabotage groups, that there may be a legitimate permit issued for a protest in a certain area, but then you get these sort of sabotage groups that come in and cause disruption, cause property damage, you know, have behaviors that the initial group that had the permit didn't, you know, plan for. The other thing was with the military equipment is I think that one excuse for in our bloated budget, Pentagon budget, to constantly be buying more is that, well, how are you disposing with what you have? Is last year's tank model really obsolete that we need to constantly be buying more? And then what are you doing with that stuff? So they're trying to justify it by, you know, acting like we need this on the street in police departments. And those mostly are giant boondoggle white elephants for police departments that don't need them, but we're given them for free and got the training to use them. And then the question is, are they looking for excuses to use them since they own them and maintain them and are trained in them? So it's really frightening prospect with the military equipment distribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first point that you made about I've just sort of lost my train of thought. What was the first point that you made about the the sabotage groups coming in? And I think that you know, it is very tricky, and there has to be a level and real discretion used, and that takes a lot of training and expertise and good leadership. So, you know, if somebody's graffitiing on you know, say like a city wall, something, and it's something that can be dealt with, you know, what is the appropriate response to that versus someone smashing in a store owner's building who need, you know, that requires an arrest, you know. So it's kind of thinking through and having the discretion used in a very smart way with good leadership, I think, is one of the key things. But you're not going to, you know, you're not going to stop every I guess every overreach, and you're not going to stop all of the potential happenings that could go on. So right now in New York, there is a proposal for new law that says that there's enhanced penalization of rioting if a person is a non-resident. So that was directly in response to the idea that there were people coming from outside New York and trying to kind of create havoc.
Right. I think during those Black Lives Matter protests, you had those white supremacy groups that were basically, you know, trying to make those peaceful protests turn violent or look violent, that, you know, we saw a lot of.
Yeah, and we saw, I mean, there's so many protests, like big and small, across the country that went off completely nonviolent, you know, and so it's, but any given, you know, everybody, say in a local police department, has to be prepared, not knowing what's going to really happen, you know. And it seemed that the protests in Portland were really predominantly peaceful, and they had gone on so long, but were also winding down when the federal presence kind of ratcheted it back up.
Other questions? Okay, Randy?
Yeah, very good talk. Thank you very much. What can you say about what's been so recently, what happened in Portland with the federal government bringing in troops, quote unquote, to protect the federal courthouse against the, you know, wishes of the local government? I mean, isn't that really a kind of a constitutional violation?
Yeah. So, I mean, really it is, and especially this, you know, like it was something that, you know, I read something that was like the city, at the city level, the state level, and the federal level, all the officials from Portland were in agreement, which was like kind of, you know, like very uncommon to happen, that you know, so when I say the federal level, I mean the representatives from Oregon in the federal system, they were all against the federal presence. And so I think that the argument from the Trump administration is that there's an insurrection act, that, you know, they can bring in the military. And I think the question there is, if this was actually, it will be challenged, it has been challenged, and so we just have to see how it plays out in the courts. But I think that you're right that there is a constitutional violation, because was that really insurrection? You know, was it something that you know, the local police seemed to be protecting the building, nobody had invaded the federal courthouse, and so it strikes as a clear overreach. So you had, it was led by the Department of Homeland Security, and they were in collaboration with some of the other agencies and brought agents from ICE and from different agencies. And what I've read so far is that they didn't have training in, you know, this type of work at all as well.
It's very scary. We had read for book club this book, It Can't Happen Here. You're probably familiar. And it's like, it's happening here right now.
Well, interestingly, Chicago and about 5 cities, I don't know if I have it written down what cities, but there are about 5 cities that have preemptively started taking cases to prevent the government, the federal government bringing troops in. So one of the organizations in Chicago said that they were doing it as, you know, is possibly going to be looked at as the courts as premature. But if they were allowed to bring the case, it would mean that as soon as something happened, they could get a judge on a phone for an for arguably to make an argument for an injunction. Whereas if they wait until there is a bigger federal presence, then it can take, you know, you have to sort of like, you know, file all the paperwork then, and it can take longer to have some action. So, I mean, one thing I do see is that there's a lot of cities that are now on alert for this, and there's been a pushback on it. So, but yeah, certainly unprecedented and scary. In Washington, D.C., obviously there's a different calculation, but who would think that, you know, you protest in front of the White House and you get tear gassed by military police, you know?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Bill, did you have a question?
Yes. There was a line on the last slide, I believe it was, about the United States resuming their role as a global leader on human rights. And if you accept that leaders should lead by example, when was the United States ever a global leader in human rights?
Okay, yeah, very good question. I think that what you could look at is the in that regard is, I would never argue that we were the leader, or we were not without major double standards, but more that we led on some issues at some time. We were looked at, and there was a participation in a lot of international institutions that we aren't doing now. So I think it's a very fair point. I may consider revising that title. I'm so used to having conversations in my classes about, there's an assumption that our Constitution is, you know, preferable to a lot of other systems, and that our Constitution is protecting us and that. And so, you know, there's 2 threads to it. There's one is like, you know, what are we doing on the world stage? And there's also like, what are we doing at home? And I think that what's really refreshing about recent protests is there seems to be wider acknowledgement of some of the issues at home than there had been for a long time. But in the meanwhile, and on the kind of world stage, you know, look at the, you know, we're as a government, our government is taking us out of WHO right during a pandemic, you know, so that's where, you know, previously we may not be pristine, but we would have been looked at, and our experts would have been involved in, for example, writing the International Criminal Court statute, even though our Congress would never have ratified it. You know, so there's always that contradiction.
Thank you.
Sure.
So just a quick time check. It's 7 minutes to noon. So we'll try and keep it to about 7 minutes. Hands up for questions. Beata, you want to go ahead?
Sure, go.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I enjoyed the talk, and
William or Bill, whom I don't know personally, but he had had my question about when were we ever leaders in that. And as far as our speaker is concerned, Marny, I think that's really an important point to make to young people, because we do have this provincial attitude that we are it. Even today, that our constitution, blah, blah. The only difference is with many other good, quote, good constitutions, it was the first secular constitution, I think, in the world. I have another question, and that has to do with Michigan. Michigan, as we know, we had armed citizens coming in to, quote, escort legislators. They were invited by some of them, which tend to be all Republican, by the way, the legislation in Michigan, Flint. There is nothing on the law that in Michigan on the law that prohibits armed citizens entering the Capitol. Do you know if that is generally the case in a few other states as well? Like if I come in with a gun, can I just do that? Because these people did come in. As a matter of fact, most people don't know, but the next day, the one Black woman legislator, she came in with her own Black armed escort. That was never hit the news, but it happens to be true.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because she said she didn't count on the Capitol Police to protect her. So my question is, can anybody just walk in other states as well, and or in Michigan also? Or do you have to be invited? These armed citizens were invited by certain legislatures to escort them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I don't know the Michigan law well enough on arms and that, but there are states that allow open carry. And so if it's an open carry state, then there can be certain buildings where it's restricted. So for example, you know, it can be that like Texas is open carry, but it used to be that there was no open carry on universities, and then they changed the law on that. And within the Second Amendment decisions at this moment, that range is all right. Where in New Jersey, we don't have that. And so you wouldn't be able to walk into the New Jersey, you know, equivalent. So I don't know well enough Michigan as to, like, you know, like you said, the invitation, or, you know, do the guards allow that? You know, certainly if you were going into any of our official buildings in New Jersey or in New York, you know, you couldn't just walk in with a...
Yeah. Well, you can in Michigan.
Yeah. And you can carry a gun around campus in Texas.
In Texas, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Take it to church.
You can take it to church.
Yeah. Anyone else want to raise their hand for a question? Okay, well then I think we've gotten everybody satisfied with questions, and I really want to thank you again, Marny. This is a really good good session, good talk. Thanks for adjusting to our new reality with the with not being able to meet in person. So people, feel free to unmute yourselves to actually express some thanks, enthusiasm, and applause. And and with that, we'll let Marny
thank you.
Go with all of our thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hope to meet you all in person at some point.
Yeah, and I've invited Marny back, particularly once we can meet back in person. She has other expertise and other topics that she speaks on. So we hope to have her back in person. I don't know about the near future, but in the future at some point.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And people can feel free to stay on if they want and talk to each other, socialize a little bit. But thank you for joining us for this virtual forum. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have constructive criticism or suggestions, please email me. You can call me. My phone number is out there, but here it is. If you want to write it down, 732-996-9670. Our September forum will, of course, also be on Zoom like this, and we'll set the topic and publicize it within the next couple weeks. So once again, feel free if you want to stick around for a little bit and chat with some of the other people you see in the session. All right, so let's see. And thanks for your questions, those of you who asked questions. They were all good. By the way, I tried to, in the real time, find some information about that that demonstration that Lois was talking about, and I couldn't find anything easily within the 5 minutes that I was trying all sorts of different search terms with Elberon and train station and whatever. If anybody else was trying and found something, let me know.
Hi, I was thinking of possibly my wife and I going to that Elberon, but we're nervous at the traffic. They probably have Ocean Avenue closed off. We're coming from north, like Highlands area. I'm thinking maybe just head to the train station, the back way, away from the shore area. Maybe we can get in, and then once if we can park, then I guess if that is in fact happening, where there will be a march to the area where the fundraiser is being held. So I guess we can always just try, and then if we can't get through, let's go home.
Yeah, no, I think you should be able to get through, even if you took like, you know, Route 36 and on down. You should be able to get all the way to where 36 bends back to the parkway on Joe Line Avenue. And then from there, you can probably just continue to take, I'm trying to think of how this will work. I think you could just continue to venture south from there. And if you wanted to be a little bit interior, you could even get as far interior as like Route 35 or something like that, which I think runs parallel to the tracks.
Thanks. Real quick on just I think I emailed you. Maybe I could call you personal, but it's funny that you were mentioning about the recording. And I don't know if this is the first meeting that has been recorded, but anyway, some of the last meetings I wasn't able to make on Zoom, so I had emailed you, I believe, asking if there's a way to get a recording of these conversations and the lectures and all that. And I didn't hear back, but so I'm assuming now you're doing it or we're doing it. So
yeah. So the recordings rely on a couple of different factors. One is first we always get agreement from the speaker. And this time I did it in real time because I hadn't addressed that with her in advance and she agreed. But the immediately previous speaker, I asked specifically that we not record him because he was speaking about a book he'd just written and he had some agreement with his publisher not to have recorded talks about the book out there for free on the internet, which is interesting, but that sometimes happens. We've had other speakers ask not to be recorded. I would say 90% of the time, the speaker's okay with it. Then the question is, how is our ability to do the recording? I did capture it this time, So I think the technical aspect is good, at least for capture. And then the third sort of gating factor is the sort of post-processing of the recording and getting it up online. And I rely on usually Alex Rios and Ron Flannery to make that happen. There probably will be a bit of a lag time. It'll take them a little while to get that organized. But for this one, I think you should be able to see it up on YouTube before too long, within a month or so, I would imagine. And if you go to the website, there is a link on the website, and if you have trouble finding it, I can probably assist, where there's a link to the YouTube channel where you can find previous talks, and there's quite a few up there from,
Oh, it's on the website, the links? Okay.
There are links on the website, but the actual video is hosted on YouTube. So presumably you could go directly to YouTube and type into the search Red Bank Humanists and probably pick it up that way.
Oh,
I haven't
okay.
in a while, but it worked a couple of years ago when I tried that method. It probably will still work today.